Before there was land or sky, before the time could be measured or memory could take shape, there was only the void. An endless expanse of nothingness. No light, no sound, no life. From within that emptiness, two presences emerged. They were not born, nor created in any way mortals would understand. They simply were. And though they shared the same origin, they did not share the same conviction. One looked upon the void and saw perfection in its stillness. To him, nothingness was not absence, it was mercy. The other looked upon it and felt the ache of unrealized possibility. The first would come to be known as the observer, a being of contemplation, restraint, and inevitability. The second was Etera, whose will bent toward creation, motion, and life. The observer believed that existence itself was a flaw. In time, all things would decay, all life would suffer, all effort would end in loss. To create a world was not an act of hope, it was a sentence of suffering postponed. But where the observer saw inevitability as a reason not to create, Etera saw it as the very reason creation mattered. She believed that meaning did not come from permanence, but from choice. That even fleeting moments of wonder, courage, and love were worth the certainty of an ending. The observer could not accept this. To him, restraint was mercy, non-existence was purity. In his eyes, allowing life to suffer was not compassion, it was indulgence. And when Etera chose to act despite his objections, the first and greatest fracture of all began. Etera shaped the world. She gave form to land and sea, forest and desert. She shaped beasts to roam the earth and creatures to fill the skies and depths. Life spread across her creation, wild and untamed. And at the heart of this world were humanity. They were not the strongest, nor the most durable, but they were adaptable, curious, capable of learning, and of choosing differently than their nature demanded, for better or for worse. From her own essence, Etera then shaped her children, the gods. Each was bound to a domain, not as a tyrant, but as a steward. They were meant to guide, to protect, and to preserve balance, not to rule by force. Thus began the ancient era. It was a time before recorded history, when dragons and colossal beasts roamed freely across the land. The world was alive, beautiful, violent, and untamed. But humanity, still young and fragile, could not yet survive in such a world. So Etera sheltered them. To protect humanity from the ferocity of the ancient era, Etera raised a temple in the sky, a sanctuary suspended above the dangers of the world below, a suspension of fate, not its escape. Even Etera, in that moment, chose to lay over confrontation. Within its walls, humanity lived apart from the primal world, and among them were the Elysians, an advanced people of Etera's ancient past. The Elysians were not merely guardians of creation, but its architects. They existed before even Etera and the Observer, and both of them were shaped by their design. Foreseeing a calamity yet to come, Etera placed many of them into a form of preservation, sealing them within her temple to await a safer age. For a time, balance held, but the Observer remained. As the ancient era stretched on, the divide between Etera and her brother grew irreconcilable. The Observer remained ever watchful, bound not by walls, but by purpose. He etched symbols into a great monolith whose meaning even gods did not fully understand. He observed every choice, every failure, every loss. To him, each act of creation only confirmed what he already believed. Life suffered, civilizations would one day fall. Everything Etera had made would end, and slowly contemplation hardened into resolve. The Observer no longer merely questioned creation, he rejected it, not in anger, but in certainty. And certainty, once absolute, leaves no room for mercy. He withdrew further into himself, his purpose shifting from observation to correction, from witness to opposition. What had once been a philosophical dissent began to take form as something absolute. Creation had gained an enemy. The void, which had lingered at the edges of existence, began to answer him, no longer as a silent abyss, but as a force shaped by will. Through him, the void learned direction. Creatures twisted beyond their natural forms. Places once untouched began to decay. Reality itself bent under the pressure of something that did not belong. This was not destruction by conquest, it was erosion. The world was being unmade slowly, deliberately, as if the Observer sought not to end creation, but to prove that it could not sustain itself, eventually transforming him into a being known in later ages as Oribus, the god of oblivion, the embodiment of the void's desire to return all things to emptiness. Etera could no longer deny what her brother had become. The being who once merely watched now sought correction, and correction meant annihilation. Etera knew she could not destroy her brother. They were bound by origin, and by forces older than the world itself. To unmake him entirely would unravel creation along with him, but there was still one door yet not closed, one last glimmer of hope to contain the void's will. She confronted the Observer, now Oribus, embodiment of the void's will, and bound him. Through an immense sacrifice, Etera sealed Oribus within a lotus construct, a prison forged to contain what could not be erased. Nearly all of her remaining power was poured into maintaining this binding. Instead of letting her brother reverse creation itself, she chose to spend her entire life force imprisoning him, forever breaking the bond of their shared blood. There would be no one left to share the burden of that choice. It was not victory, it was existential sacrifice. During the imprisonment of Orbis, something was torn from his very being. Not his soul, not fragments, the Epoch, the last uncorrupted essence of himself, the final purity of his vessel, left behind when the rest was sealed away. A scar made manifest, proof that even inevitability can be wounded. Eterra could have unmade it. She chose instead to leave it behind, and in that choice, she forged the Epoch's purpose. The Epoch was bound to time itself. Through it, timelines could be stabilized, futures glimpsed, and temporal boundaries breached. It could cleanse the Void's corruption from the world, but only where something remained to be saved. It could not resurrect what was already lost. Its power was vast, absolute, dangerous, and Eterra knew that if it was ever wielded without restraint, it would be as catastrophic as the Void it was meant to oppose. So she shattered it, not out of fear, but grief. For even mercy, left unchecked, could become tyranny. The Epoch was broken into 3 shards, each containing only a fragment of its temporal authority, a resonance that allowed them to call to one another when brought close. If ever reassembled, they would draw their bearer toward a place beyond all eras, the end of time. This was not hope, it was contingency. Eterra understood the existential cost the moment the prison closed in around her brother. With her strength consumed, she could no longer sustain the world as she once had. To preserve the world, she had chosen a future without herself. The temple in the sky, the sanctuary that had protected humanity and sheltered the Elysians for untold ages, began to fail. And then it fell. As the temple of Eterra crashed from the heavens, both creator and destroyer vanished from the world. One sealed beyond time, the other spent beyond return. The ancient era ended not with triumph, but with absence. And absence too would eventually shape the world. Without Eterra's guiding presence, life continued. Not because it was safe, but because it had already begun. The gods remained to shepherd what they could, but even they understood the truth of what had been lost. Creation no longer had its architect, and without guidance, choice became humanity's burden to bear. The Void had not been destroyed. Orbis was bound, sealed beyond reach, but his prison was not eternal. The Lotus construct could delay the inevitable, not prevent it. Somewhere beyond time, the Void waited, patient and unyielding. The gods ruled their domains as best they could. Mortals built cities, formed empires, and shaped cultures. The world entered an age of growth and devotion, an age that would later be called the Divine Era. But beneath the surface of progress, time itself had changed. The Epoch had altered reality. Though its shards were scattered and incomplete, their influence lingered. Timelines no longer flowed cleanly. Echoes of possible futures surfaced in dreams and visions. Moments repeated. Paths diverged where none had before. They recognized that the Epoch, even shattered, was now the single most dangerous object in existence. Not because it could end the world, but because it could decide which world would survive. From this realization, a covenant had been formed. They were not kings, they were not champions. They did not seek power, they sought to prevent certainty. They were called the Keepers. Chosen not for strength, but for restraint, the Keepers swore an oath unlike any other. The Epoch would never be made whole again. Not by gods, not by mortals, not by any force that believed it knew the correct future. For knowing that the greatest power is the one left unused. Each shard was hidden, separated, and guarded by ancient mechanisms and sanctuaries known only to the Order. One shard was sealed within a fortress, locked behind constructs born of Eterra's ancient designs. Another was buried deep within the Stonefall Mountains, surrounded by traps that only the Keepers could navigate. A third was never allowed to rest, constantly moved between vaults, its path known only to those bound by oath. The Epoch was not meant to be used freely. It was meant to exist as a last resort, a reminder that the future was not fixed. Neither was it something to be rewritten lightly. And the Keepers understood that time could not be trusted in the hands of the ambitious. But still, the Divine Era was not an age of peace. It was an age of preparation, an age where fate could be delayed, but never denied. And it is here, at the edge of that fragile balance, that the world once more dares to choose. As it always has.